December 1982. Somewhere in the United States government, an analyst is reading a Soviet radio transcript. Moscow is broadcasting a claim, a specific claim, that the United States military, our military, used biological weapons developed by Japanese war criminals against civilian populations in Vietnam and Cuba. The official American position is that this is propaganda. This is Soviet Union doing what the Soviet Union does, weaponizing lies, fake news. And that's certainly what it looks like, except the government calling it propaganda is also sitting on a stack of classified documents that confirm the core of what Moscow is saying. The United States did make a deal with Japanese war criminals. The United States did acquire their research, and they buried it. The CIA knew, the Pentagon knew, the White House knew. They knew for almost 40 years. Let me take you back further. Much further. It's August 1945, Manchuria, China. A massive compound is on fire. A Japanese general just ordered the destruction of every document, every sample, every piece of evidence inside the facility. He also ordered the elimination of the only people who can testify to what happened, the prisoners. Then he boards a plane and disappears. His name is Shiro Ishii, and the place that's burning behind him is called Pingfang. For over a decade inside those buildings, Japanese doctors, real doctors with real medical degrees from Japan's most prestigious universities, conducted experiments on human beings that were so extreme, so deliberate, so thoroughly documented in their own records that when American investigators finally learned the truth, they faced a terrible choice: prosecute the perpetrators or strike a deal. They chose the deal. And what makes this really strange is the chain of consequences that followed. The cover-up created a propaganda weapon that the Soviets would use against America for decades. The men who ran the program went home and built careers. One of them founded a pharmaceutical company that eventually poisoned thousands of its own countrymen. And the people killed inside Pingfang, they never received an apology, not from Japan or the United States. Not from anyone. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. Tonight we dive into the dark history of Japan's Unit 731 and a deal struck with the US government. This is Unit 731. Stay with me. To really know what happened at Pingfang, you have to understand the man who built it. Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 in Chibu Prefecture, Japan. His family were the largest landowners in their village, wealthy, prominent, the kind of people who expected their children to amount to something. Ishii amounted to something. He was brilliant, an eidetic photographic memory, academic record that opened every door. He graduated from the medical department of Kyoto Imperial University in 1920 and joined the Army Medical Corps almost immediately. He was also, by every account from people who knew him, arrogant, merciless, socially calculated in a way that never quite looked calculated. He charmed superiors. He used subordinates. He married the daughter of a university president. He was exactly the kind of man who rises in institutions. And in 1925, he read something that changed the course of his life, the Geneva Protocol. June 17, 1925. 44 nations gathered in Switzerland and signed an international agreement prohibiting the use of biological and chemical weapons in warfare. The world just lived through mustard gas in the trenches of World War I. The consensus was clear. These weapons were too horrible. They had to be banned. Japan's representatives were at the conference. They helped draft the agreement. Most people read the Geneva Protocol as a moral statement. Shiro Ishii read it as a product review. His reasoning went like this: if the world's most powerful military nations agreed that something was worth banning, it must work. You don't ban ineffective weapons, you ban the ones that scare you. And if biological weapons scared the greatest powers in the world, then Japan needed those biological weapons. He started lobbying, quietly at first, then more openly. He cultivated patrons, powerful men in the military and the government who could move his ambitions forward. He was appointed professor of immunology at the Army Medical College in Tokyo, where he conducted research with increasing freedom. In 1928, on the recommendation of his university mentor, Ishii embarked on a 2-year tour of 25 Western countries, Europe, the United States. He studied biological and chemical warfare research, things that other nations knew that Japan didn't. how far they were. He came back convinced the gap was serious. He also came back with something else, a fully formed argument for why Japan specifically needed to pursue this program. Japan, he argued, lacked the mineral resources of its rivals. Conventional weapons required steel, oil, industrial capabilities. Biological weapons were cheap. They were scalable. They were, in the right conditions, undetectable. And they could be deployed across vast distances against civilian populations as easily as military ones. This isn't the argument of a scientist, it's the argument of a strategist. By 1932, Ishii had exactly what he needed. Japan invaded Manchuria the previous year and established a puppet state. Picture a vast territory under Japanese military control, thousands of miles from Tokyo, with minimal international scrutiny and an unlimited supply of prisoners that the Japanese military had no particular use for. In August 1932, with backing from an ultra-nationalist minister of health, Ishii received authorization to establish an epidemic prevention laboratory in Manchuria. The cover story was exactly what the name implied: epidemic prevention, water purification, public health research. The reality was something else entirely. Human experimentation began in the fall of 1933. Ishii's first facility was called a fortress. It was about 100 kilometers south of Harbin. Approximately 1,000 prisoners were held there. Blood was drained from them at intervals of 2 to 3 days, relentlessly, systematically, just to see how much the human body could give before it gave out. But the facility had a problem. In 1934, prisoners staged a breakout. In 1935, an explosion, believed to be sabotage, damaged the compound. The secrecy that Ishii depended on was compromised, so he shut it down and built something bigger. In 1936, Emperor Hirohito issued a formal decree integrating Ishii's program into the Kwangtung Army and authorizing its expansion, its funding, staff, and infrastructure, an imperial endorsement at the highest level. The new facility would be built at Pingfang, 24 kilometers south of Harbin. It's a remote district. A rail line could be run directly to it. They could construct an airfield nearby. The compound could be surrounded by walls high enough that no one outside would ever see what happened inside. Now, construction took 4 years. When it was completed in 1940, Ishii held a ceremony, and at that ceremony, he said something remarkable. He said, "A doctor's God-given mission is to prevent disease and heal the sick." Then he paused, and he said, "The work upon which we are now about to embark is the complete opposite of these principles." He said it out loud in front of his staff. He said it like it was something to be proud of. What he built wasn't a hospital. It wasn't a research campus. It was a factory of horrors. 150 buildings, 3,000 personnel, capacity for 600 prisoners at a time, rotating through as they were used up. Had its own power plant, its own water supply, cremation facilities, because there'd be a great deal to cremate. And to staff it, Ishii did something that implicates far more than just one man or one facility. He went back to Japan's universities, Kyoto Imperial, Tokyo Imperial, the most prestigious medical institutions in the country, and he made an offer to professors there. "Send me your students," Ishii said. "Send me your researchers. They'll conduct experiments in Manchuria that you can't conduct in Japan. And when they send their data back to you, you can publish it under your own name." The professors accepted. The students were sent. Research conducted on human beings in Manchuria was dressed up in academic language and published in Japan's leading medical journals. Careers were built on it. Reputations were made. But the corruption didn't stop at the gates of Pingfang. It spread through the entire Japanese medical establishment like a disease. By the late 1930s, Ishii's network extended across China and Southeast Asia. At its height, the Ishii network encompassed over 10,000 personnel. He built an empire, and inside that empire, things were happening that most of his staff would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. What did Pingfang look like? Well, from the outside, it looked like nothing. A walled compound in a flat remote district south of Harbin, tall enough walls that you couldn't see inside, a rail line running directly to the facility for supplies, they said, personnel and equipment. The locals had a rumor about the place. They said the tall chimneys meant that it was a crematorium, that something was being burned there constantly in large quantities. And they were right, but they didn't even know half of it. Inside those walls were a self-contained world, 150 buildings, laboratories, operating rooms, animal holding facilities, because they needed animals for comparison studies. Now, barracks for 3,000 staff members who worked there, administrative buildings, a library with extensive foreign language holdings and 6 specialist librarians to maintain it. The youth corps members, who were recruited as teenage boys to work at Pingfang, some of them barely 14 years old, described studying from 8 in the morning and then assisting researchers in the afternoon, sleeping 3 hours at night. There was a prison block at the center of the compound. The research and laboratory areas were built around it so that doctors could walk from their workspaces directly to the cells. The cells held at any given time up to 600 people. Those people had a name inside Pingfang: Maruta. In Japanese, Maruta means logs, wooden logs. The cover story for the compound was that it was a lumber operation, which is where the word came from. But the staff used it for something else. They used it for the prisoners. Called them logs so that they'd stop being people. Call them logs, and what you do to them stops being murder. It becomes something easier to deal with. At least for a while. But where did the prisoners come from? Well, the Japanese military police supplied them. The Special Services Agency supplied them. They were described in official records as enemies of the state, spies, saboteurs, criminals. In practice, they were whoever authorities decided to send. The vast majority were Chinese. Civilians, farmers, laborers, people who'd been in the wrong place, people who'd been denounced by a neighbor or picked up in a military sweep or taken because the unit needed subjects and this person happened to be available. There were also Russians, Koreans, and Mongolians. And based on evidence that's strong but not fully documented, Allied prisoners of war. Americans, British, Australians. How many? Under what circumstances? That remains contested, but the evidence exists. What's not contested is this. There's no known survivors. Every prisoner who entered Pingfang died there. Those who didn't die from the experiments were killed before the war ended to eliminate witnesses. When a new prisoner arrived, the process was methodical. They were given a physical examination. Blood and stool samples were taken. Kidney function was tested. Their baseline health was documented precisely because you can't measure the effect of a pathogen on the human body if you don't know what the body looked like before you introduce the pathogen. They were well fed. Rice, wheat, meat, fish, occasionally alcohol. Now, this wasn't kindness. It was data hygiene. You need your subjects in normal health at the start of an experiment. Otherwise, the results would be compromised. And the results mattered here. This was, in Ishii's mind, science. Rigorous, systematic, carefully documented science. The kind of science that could only be conducted because the subjects had no rights, because no one was coming for them, and because inside those walls, the normal rules of what human beings are simply didn't apply. We know the term they use the most, logs. One former member who'd been recruited into the youth corps at 14 described preserving human specimens in formalin. Heads, arms, legs, internal organs, entire bodies. There were large numbers of these jars lined up, he said. Even specimens of children. He said it quietly at a public exhibition in Japan 50 years after the fact, and still not giving his name. The staff who worked at Pingfang weren't monsters in the way we usually imagine monsters. They were doctors, they were researchers and university graduates, young men who were recruited with promises of advancement, good salaries, and scientific opportunity. One former member described the pay in Manchuria as better than a school principal's salary back in Japan. Another said that Manchuria in 1938 was like heaven for the Japanese. Plenty of food, good pay, good status. They were raised in a system that told them the emperor was divine. Japan was a sacred nation, and the Chinese and the Russians and the Koreans were inferior races. They were told by an army doctor instructor at Kyoto Imperial University that medicine wasn't for healing the sick. Medicine was a weapon, so they used it. A former member, a hygiene specialist who worked at Pingfang, was asked decades later why he did what he did. He said, "I killed people for the country, for the emperor. I never thought that what I was doing was wrong." That's what Pingfang was. Not a rogue operation or a secret from the Japanese government. This wasn't the work of a few sadistic outliers operating outside the chain of command. It's a facility that received imperial authorization in 1936, that was funded by the Japanese military budget, that was staffed by graduates of Japan's finest universities, that sent experimental data back to professors at those universities, who then published it in academic journals. That was known at the highest levels to be exactly what it was. And inside it, what was actually happening? Stay with me, because this next part's the hardest part of the story to tell, and it needs to be told. Unit 731 wasn't a secret kept inside a laboratory. It was a weapons program, and starting in 1939, Ishii began using it like one. The first field deployment came during the Nomahan incident. It was a border conflict between Japan and the Soviet Union along the Mongolian frontier in the summer of 1939. Unit 731 personnel dumped typhoid bacteria directly into a river tributary that fed into the Soviet-held territory. The operation failed. Typhoid in fast-moving water disperses and loses its effectiveness rapidly. The contamination never reached concentrations high enough to cause an outbreak. Ishii noted the failure. He adjusted the methodology and tried again. October 1940, the port city of Ningbo, China. Japanese planes flow low over the city and they release their payload. What fell from those planes were not conventional ordnance. It was a mixture of plague-inflected fleas, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. It was mixed with rice, wheat, and grain. The grain was there to attract the rats. The rats would spread the fleas would spread the plague. The attack actually killed 99 people, and it wasn't the last. 4 days later, October 4th, a plane dropped a similar payload over Shuzhen in the Xinjiang province. 21 plague deaths followed. Then on November 4th, 1941, a single low-flying plane appeared at dawn over the city. It dropped wheat, rice, cotton wadding, and unidentified particles. 7 days later, the first plague case appeared. The epidemic continued into January of 1942. What makes this incident significant, beyond the deaths, is who witnessed it. Foreign residents were present in Changte, missionaries, medical workers. Among them was a woman named Mrs. E.J. Bannon. She was a superintendent of the local Presbyterian hospital. She documented what she saw. She couldn't be dismissed as Chinese propaganda. Western eyewitnesses placed Japanese biological weapons on the ground. But the most consequential deployment, the one that reveals something extraordinary about this program, was the Zhejiang campaign of 1942. Japanese ground forces were advancing through the province. As they moved through the region, Unit 731 personnel deployed biological agents, plague, cholera, typhoid against Chinese villages, their water supplies, everything. The operation was a catastrophe, but not for China, for Japan. The biological agents were so poorly controlled, the vectors so unpredictable, that the outbreak turned back on the advancing Japanese forces. More than 10,000 Japanese military personnel were infected. Approximately 1,700 of them died from their own weapons. Let me say that again. The Imperial Japanese Army's medical warfare program, the program that Shiro Ishii spent a decade building, that consumed thousands of lives inside Pingfang, that received imperial authorization and military funding and the participation of Japan's finest medical minds, it just killed more Japanese soldiers than it did documented enemy combatants. The weapon turned on the hand that held it. Ishii was furious. The program was temporarily scaled back, but it didn't stop. In 1942, as Japanese forces retreated from Nanjing, Unit 731 personnel distributed bread rolls to Chinese prisoners of war as a gift. Approximately 3,000 bread rolls, and each one was injected with typhoid and a paratyphoid bacteria. Over the course of the war, Unit 731 and affiliated units deployed biological weapons across an enormous swath of Chinese territory. The precise death toll is one of the most contested questions in the historical record. Sheldon Harris, in his book Factories of Death, estimates approximately 200,000 civilian deaths from biological warfare deployment. Daniel Barenblatt, in A Plague Upon Humanity, puts that figure as high as 580,000. Wikipedia cites the range between 200,000 and 500,000. None of these figures include the deaths inside Pingfang itself. Now, I'll present that range honestly. It's somewhere between 200,000 and 580,000 people that died in Chinese cities and villages as a direct result of Unit 731's field operations. The real number is almost certainly closer to the higher end of that range. We'll never know for sure exactly because Ishii made sure we couldn't. There's one more operation I need to tell you about. It never happened, but the fact that it was approved tells you everything about how far this program had gone by 1944. The operation was called Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan was this: Japanese submarines would carry specially modified aircraft across the Pacific Ocean to positions off the coast of California. Now, those aircraft would then fly over American cities, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and release clouds of plague-inflected fleas over the civilian population below. Now, the operation was approved by Japanese military command. It was scheduled for September 22nd, 1945. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. The American mainland was 38 days away from a biological weapons attack. What do you think of that? Think about it for a second. The people living in San Diego in the summer of 1945, going to work, raising their children, listening to the radio for news about the Pacific, they had no idea a plan existed, no idea it was approved, no idea how close it came. They were saved not by any action of the United States government. Let me be clear about that. They were saved because Japan ran out of time. August 1945, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and begins advancing into Manchuria. Now, inside Pingfang, Ishii receives word, and he gives his final orders. August 9th, 1945, the Soviet Union launches a massive invasion of Manchuria. 3 separate army groups, over 1.5 million Soviet troops, they cross the border simultaneously. Inside Pingfang, the news arrives like a death sentence, because for Shiro Ishii, it is. And not his death. He'll live on for another 14 years, but the death of everything he built, everything he did, the evidence, the witnesses, the record. He had around 72 hours before the Soviet forces reached the compound. So he gave the orders. Destroy everything, every document, every sample, every piece of equipment that could tell someone what happened here. The research buildings were blown up. The prison block was demolished. The specialized equipment, the centrifuges, the pressure chambers, the glass-walled gas chambers were smashed or detonated. The cremation facilities were running continuously. Staff members carried armloads of documents to burn pits and fed them into the flames. Years of experimental records, pathogen logs, the careful, methodical data that Ishii always insisted be maintained in triplicate because science demanded rigor now turned to ash. It took days. The smoke over Pingfang was visible for miles. But there's a problem that documents can't solve. The prisoners. Somewhere between 3,000 and 14,000 people passed through Pingfang over the course of its operation. Estimates vary, and that variance itself is a consequence of what happened next. The prisoners still alive at the end of the war couldn't be allowed to leave. They saw too much. They knew too much. They were the one category of evidence that can't be burned, so they were killed. A number of methods: injection, potassium cyanide, some by shooting, some by other methods that former unit members haven't been willing to specify even in testimony. The bodies are cremated and there are no known survivors. On August 12, 1945, 3 days before Japan's formal surrender, Shiro Ishii boards a plane at Harbin. He takes his personal laboratory notebooks with him, doesn't look back. What happens next is, and I use this word carefully because the whole story is strange, what happens next is almost theatrical in its audacity. Ishii returns to Japan, and then he dies. There's a funeral, a proper formal funeral held in his home village. People attend, condolences are offered, the grave is prepared, except Shiro Ishii isn't dead. The funeral's staged. It's a deliberate fabrication complete with a grave marker and a death certificate arranged so that Allied investigators who Ishii knew would be looking for him would find a closed case instead of a living man. The cost of this arrangement, according to accounts that have emerged over the decades, was approximately $1 million in cash. $1 million to make Japan's most wanted war criminal disappear. He resurfaces later in the countryside in the Kawazana area, living quietly, staying out of sight, waiting to see what the Americans would do. Before he left Harbin, Ishii gathered his staff. He told them the work that they'd been doing must never become known. Told them, if you're captured, say nothing. He told them, what happened at Pingfang, take it with you to your graves. Most of them went home to Japan and tried. They became doctors, professors, medical administrators, businessmen. They built careers and families and respectable lives. Some of them were very successful. Some of them never spoke publicly about Manchuria again. Not to their colleagues, not to their children, not to their wives. Some of them had nightmares for 50 years. And a handful, towards the end of their lives, found that they couldn't do it, couldn't take it to their graves. But that comes later. For now, Pingfang is rubble and ash. The prisoners are gone, Ishii is hidden, his staff is scattered across Japan, quietly resuming their lives, and in September 1945, a ship called the Strangest pulls into the harbor at Yokohama. On board is an American microbiologist from Columbia University. He's been sent by the United States government to find out whether Japan had any biological weapons program. He has no idea what he's walking into. And waiting for him on the pier is a man who knows exactly what he's walking into. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders wasn't a spy. He was a scientist, a microbiologist from Columbia University attached to Camp Detrick, the United States Army's biological warfare research facility in Frederick, Maryland. He was good at his job. He was thorough. He was, by his own later account, completely unprepared for what was waiting for him in Japan. When the Sturgis docked at Yokohama in September of 1945, Sanders came down the gangplank expecting to conduct a standard investigative assignment, find out what the Japanese had been doing in the field of biological warfare, assess the threat, then report back. Simple. Not really. Standing on the pier was a Japanese officer holding a photograph. The photograph was of Murray Sanders. The officer introduced himself as Sanders' interpreter. His name was Ryoichi Naoto. Sanders later said he didn't even know what Unit 730 was. Naoto knew everything. So who was Ryoichi Naoto? He was Ishii's number 2 man at Tokyo's research laboratory, a virologist, a fixer, a man who understood with great precision what the Americans were looking for and exactly how much of it they could be allowed to find. Now, before the war, Naoto traveled to New York City on a mission to acquire yellow fever virus samples from the Rockefeller Institute. He presented a letter from the Japanese embassy claiming the samples were needed for legitimate medical research. When the institute refused, he tried to bribe the laboratory staff. He was turned away. Now he was standing on a pier in Yokohama, smiling, ready to help. And the interrogations began. For 9 weeks, Sanders met with Japanese officials and former military personnel through Naoto as interpreter. He asked questions, he received answers. The answers were careful, mostly partial. They were technically accurate in ways that were designed to reveal nothing. Sanders sensed it. He described the sessions later as feeling scripted, like everyone he spoke to had been prepared in advance. And he was right. What Sanders didn't know, what he couldn't discover until much later, was that Naoto was not going home at night. He was going to the Japanese military headquarters. Every night, Naoto briefed Japanese officials on exactly what Sanders had asked that day, what he seemed to know, what he seemed to suspect, what information could safely be released, and what had to be protected. Then he came back the next morning and kept interpreting. The man translating Sanders' questions was also designing the answers. After 9 weeks of getting nowhere, Sanders made a threat. He told the Japanese, if you won't cooperate with American investigators, we'll bring in the Soviets. The effect was immediate. The following morning, Naoto arrived with a document. Sanders described it later as a manuscript containing, quote, startling material, fundamentally dynamite. It outlined the biological warfare program's chain of command. It named the departments involved. It was, Sanders said, enough to implicate virtually everyone at the senior level. Sanders took it directly to General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur's response had been quoted in multiple historical accounts. He said, if you can't draw out this information, we aren't given to torture. So no stick, only a carrot. MacArthur authorized Sanders to return to Naoto with an offer. Full immunity from war crimes prosecution for everyone involved in Unit 731 in exchange for complete research data. Sanders delivered the offer. He later described Naoto's reaction as making a deep impression. After that, the data came in waves. Sanders said that he could hardly keep up. Now, I want to show you something specific, because this next piece of evidence isn't from a historian's interpretation, it's from a document. In December 1994, almost 50 years after these events, a retired Japanese military officer, 84 years old, allowed researchers to examine a collection of documents that he kept in his home since the end of the war. Now, among those documents were the handwritten notes of a Japanese interpreter who'd been present at a series of meetings between American investigators and Japanese officials at MacArthur's headquarters, the Daiichi Soga building in Tokyo, October 1946. The notes were published in a Japanese quarterly in the spring of 1995. They record in specific detail what was said in those meetings, and they include this: a statement made to Lieutenant Colonel Naoto, explicit on the record that the information being gathered was, quote, data for a secret report to the American president, not to be revealed. And then this: the investigation was, quote, not concerned with war criminals. Those meetings took place in October 1946. The war ended 13 months earlier. The immunity proposal was on the table before the end of 1945, within weeks of Sanders first stepping off that gangplank. Now, while the Americans were quietly making their deal, the Soviets were doing something very different. In December 1949, the Soviet Union convened the Khabarovsk trial. It's a formal war crimes tribunal in Russia's Far East. Now, 12 Japanese military officers and scientists were tried for biological warfare crimes. All 12 were found guilty. Sentences ranged from 2 22 to 25 years. The testimony at Khabarovsk was specific and detailed. Prisoners tied to stakes, anthrax bombs, gas gangrene experiments, the same program, the same crimes, the same facility. The Western response was almost universal dismissal. It's Soviet propaganda, they said, a show trial, a politically motivated fabrication designed to embarrass the United States and Japan. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The United States government knew the testimony was substantially accurate. They knew because they obtained the same information through their own immunity deal 2 years earlier. They dismissed as Soviet propaganda a trial whose core facts they already privately confirmed. Now, at the same time, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, was convening to try Japanese leaders for war crimes committed across the Pacific. The tribunal ran from May 1946 to November of 1948. It produced convictions and executions, a sweeping historical accounting of Japanese military conduct, and it said absolutely nothing about Unit 731. Not a single charge, not a single mention, no witnesses called to testify about biological warfare. German physicians at the same moment were being tried in Nuremberg for conducting medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Some of them were hanged. The Japanese physicians who'd done the same things in greater numbers over longer periods with more systemic documentation, they went home. Multiple historians have noted this disparity. Murray Sanders returned to the United States. His first report described the Japanese biological warfare program as, quote, unimportant minor activity. He hedged. He expressed doubt that everything had been revealed, and he was right to doubt. He later admitted in 1983 that he'd been deceived. He was standing on that pier, not knowing what Unit 731 was, being handed an interpreter who knew everything. And the interpreter walked him carefully, precisely, through exactly as much truth as the Japanese side decided he could have. The Americans believed that they made a smart deal. Cold War logic. The Soviets were the new enemy. Biological weapons data was strategic intelligence. Justice for Chinese civilians was, in the calculus of 1946, a secondary concern. But were they right? Did they actually get what they paid for? The question has an answer, believe it or not. And the answer isn't good for anyone. In December 1947, 2 scientists from Camp Dietrich arrived in Tokyo. The names were Dr. Edwin V. Hill and Dr. Joseph Victor. They've been sent by the Pentagon to conduct a formal assessment of the Unit 731 data that was acquired through the immunity deal to determine in precise scientific terms what the United States had actually purchased. They spent weeks reviewing the material. On December 12, 1947, they submitted their report. The Hill and Victor report concluded that the data represented, and I'm quoting directly here, evidence gathered at the expenditure of many millions of dollars and years of work. It called the human experimentation data extraordinarily valuable. It said the evidence greatly supplemented and amplified American knowledge in the field of biological warfare. The Pentagon read the report and concluded that the deal had been worth it. Justice to the victims of Pingfang had been traded for something real, something strategically significant, something that could give the United States a meaningful advantage in the Cold War arms race. Except when American scientists at Camp Dietrich actually sat down and worked with the data, the picture became considerably less clear. The broader scientific consensus that emerged over the decades from historians of medicine, from biological warfare researchers, from scholars who reviewed both the original data and the American assessment of it, is that the experimental results derived from the human subjects at Pingfang were not meaningfully superior to what animal-based research could have produced. The methodology, for all its brutality, generated findings that competent researchers working with laboratory animals could have replicated. The data, in the judgment of many experts who examined it, is largely worthless. Now, I want to be precise here, because this is a genuinely contested question, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. A 2022 peer-reviewed paper published in the Journal of History of Medicine argued that Unit 731 experiments were methodically rigorous. The data met the expectations of the American scientists who reviewed it, and that characterizing it as worthless is an overcorrection driven more by moral discomfort than by scientific analysis. Now, other historians push back hard on that framing. They argue that the Hill and Victor report was was itself a product of Cold War-motivated reasoning, that American scientists, having already committed to the immunity deal, had every incentive to conclude that the data was valuable, that the report tells us more about what the Americans needed to believe than about what the data actually contained. I'll let you weigh that for a moment. But here's the thing that strikes me about this debate. It almost doesn't matter which side is right, because think about what each answer means. If the data was valuable, if the Hill and Victor report was correct, then the United States government knowingly traded prosecution of war criminals for strategic military advantage. Eyes open, full knowledge of what was being covered up. A deliberate choice to prioritize Cold War positioning over justice for thousands of murdered civilians. And if the data wasn't valuable, if the broader consensus is right and the results were largely worthless, then the United States government traded the prosecution of war criminals for nothing. They let the men who ran Pingfang go home and build careers in exchange for data that they couldn't use. Either way, someone paid. And it wasn't the United States government. It was the people in the cells at Pingfang, the people whose names were mostly unknown, the woman on the operating table, the 3-month-old infant, the 40 prisoners who broke free at Anda and were run over with trucks. They paid. There's one more dimension to this deal that I need to lay out before we move on. The immunity agreement wasn't just a transaction, it was a secret. The United States government classified the existence of the deal, the content of the Hill and Victor report, and the scope of the immunity granted to Unit 731 personnel. Now, this information wasn't made available to the public, to Congress, or to the American allies. The Khabarovsk trial, the Soviet tribunal that put the same evidence on the record in 1949, was publicly dismissed as communist propaganda, but the Soviets knew the truth. They knew because the Khabarovsk trial generated its own documentation, and because they captured their own Japanese POWs with knowledge of the program. They knew that the United States struck a deal and buried it. In the years that followed, they used that knowledge, not in a courtroom or through diplomatic channels, on the radio. Which brings us back to where this story began. Washington, 1982. A CIA analyst reading a Soviet broadcast. The cover-up that was supposed to protect American interests became the most powerful propaganda weapon the Soviets have ever used against America for 40 years. The secret wouldn't stay buried. It never does. The war ended. The deal was made, and the men who ran Pingfang went home. Shiro Ishii eventually emerged from hiding. The fake funeral was quietly forgotten. The grave marker remained. Ishii himself resurfaced. He was alive and free in the years that followed. And he did something that tells you everything about the confidence the immunity deal had given him. He lectured United States Army officers at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Ishii, the man who ordered the killing of every prisoner at Pingfang to eliminate eyewitnesses, who staged his own death to avoid capture, who presided over more than a decade of systemic human experimentation, stood in front of American military personnel and shared his findings. Then he returned to private medical practice in Japan. He died on October 9, 1959, throat cancer. He was 67 years old, never charged with a crime, never tried. He never publicly acknowledged what he'd done. He died in bed. Ryoichi Nato, the man who was waiting on the pier, the man who'd spent 9 weeks carefully managing Murray Sanders, the man who negotiated the immunity deal from the Japanese side, he didn't retire quietly either. In 1950, he founded the Japan Blood Bank, blood products company with technical assistance from the United States occupation officials. He installed Kitano Masaji, the second commander of Unit 731, as director. In 1964, the Japan Blood Bank was renamed. Its new name was Green Cross Corporation. Grew rapidly. By the 80s, Green Cross was Japan's largest pharmaceutical company. It's a leading producer of blood products, a pillar of the Japanese medical establishment. Murray Sanders, the American investigator who'd been deceived on that pier in 1945, served as a consultant to the company. And then in the 80s, Green Cross became the center of a scandal. HIV-contaminated blood products were distributed to patients across Japan. Up to 3,000 people, the majority of them hemophiliacs who depended on blood clotting treatment to survive. The contamination had been known, not suspected. This had been known, to be clear. Green Cross continued distributing the products after internal awareness of the contamination risk, because recalling them would have been expensive, and because the heat treatment process required to make the product safe would have cut into their profit margins. So up to 3,000 Japanese citizens were infected with HIV, and many of them died. And here's the detail that closes the circle. The government laboratory responsible for testing and certifying Green Cross blood products as safe, the laboratory whose sign-off allowed the contaminated products to remain on the market, was staffed by former Unit 731 members, the same men who certified the safety of biological agents at Pingfang were now certifying the safety blood products in post-war Japan. You can't make this stuff up. Naoto died in July 1982, just as the scandal was beginning to surface. He didn't live to face it. Kitano died in 1986. The company that bore their legacy was eventually restructured and absorbed. The criminal prosecutions that followed the HIV scandal focused on the later Green Cross executives, not the founders. The founders were already gone. Yoshimura Hisatu, the frostbite researcher, the man who'd frozen human limbs until they sounded like planks of wood, the man who subjected a 3-month-old infant to ice water immersion experiments, he became head of Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. He published academic papers on frostbite and cold injury. The papers were peer-reviewed, cited, respected. Everyone in the Japanese medical community eventually understood where the underlying data came from, and no one said anything. Yoshimura was never prosecuted. He built a distinguished academic career on research conducted on human beings in Manchuria, and these weren't isolated cases. The post-war careers of Unit 731 personnel constitute something that one historian described as a virtual who's who of the Japanese medical establishment. A former unit member became governor of Tokyo. Another became president of the Japan Medical Association. Another headed the Japanese Olympic Committee, including the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Others became department heads at universities across Japan. Senior officials in the Ministry of Health and Welfare, directors at hospitals, leaders of professional medical organizations. The network that Ishii built, drawing on the facilities of Japan's finest universities, corrupting the entire infrastructure of Japanese medicine, all of that didn't dissolve after the war. It continued in different buildings with different titles, doing different work, but it continued. For decades, the Japanese government denied that Unit 731 existed at all. When journalist Seiichi Morimura published a book called Devil's Gluttony in 1981, bringing the story to broad Japanese public consensus for the first time, the government refused to allow factual accounts of Unit 731 to appear in school textbooks. Lawsuits followed. Years of litigation over what Japanese children were permitted to learn about what Japan had done. In 2018, 73 years after the end of the war, Japan's National Archives released a document containing the names of 3,607 Unit 731 members. This is not a confession or an apology, it's a list of names. That's what accountability looked like. A list released 73 years later. But there were some, a handful towards the end of their lives, who couldn't let it rest, who found as they aged that the weight of what they carried on was too heavy to take into the ground. And in 1994 and 1995, some of them spoke up. In 1994, something happened that the Japanese government hadn't planned for. They didn't approve, and they couldn't stop. A group of Japanese citizens, historians, educators, journalists, former unit members, and the adult children of former unit members, they organized a public exhibition. They called it the Unit 731 exhibition. It traveled to 61 cities across Japan over the course of a year and a half. It was funded not by the national government, which wanted nothing to do with it, but by local governments and by admission fees paid by ordinary Japanese people who came to see it. Hundreds of thousands of them came. Most of them never heard of Unit 731. They grew up in post-war Japan, educated from textbooks that didn't mention anything about Pingfang. They failed to mention Ishii or the Maruta, the logs. They stood in front of photographs and documents and artifacts and learned for the first time what was done in their country's name. And at some of those exhibitions, the men who'd been there came forward. Elderly men, some in their 70s, their 80s, former researchers, former technicians, former youth corps members who'd been teenagers when they arrived at Pingfang. Some of them gave everything, every detail, every experiment, every memory they carried for 50 years. Most of them wouldn't give their names. They spoke behind screens or spoke through intermediaries or submitted written accounts that were read aloud by others, but they still spoke. One former member, a man who assisted in vivisection procedures, said that he decided to come forward because he didn't want to die with it unsaid. "I cannot take this to hell with me," he said. Someone has to know. Hal Gold, the author of Unit 731 testimony, attended these exhibitions. He interviewed former members, sat at their bedsides, he listened. His book is the record of what they said. It's one of the most important documents the story has produced. In China, the response wasn't exhibitions, it was lawsuits. Chinese survivors and the families of the victims brought reparation claims in Japanese courts. Years of litigation, appeals, procedural obstacles, the full weight of two governments, one unwilling to pay, one willing to press, bearing down on the plaintiffs who simply wanted someone to say, "This happened, it was wrong, and you owe us something for it." On August 28, 2002, 57 years after the end of the war, the Tokyo District Court issued a ruling. Judge Iwata wrote the following: "Evidence shows that Japanese troops, including Unit 731, used bacteriological weapons under the order of Imperial Japanese Army Headquarters, and that many local residents died as a result." Read that again. A Japanese court in Tokyo ruled that Unit 731 used biological weapons against Chinese civilians, that the Imperial Japanese Army ordered it, that people died. It was, in the precise legal sense, an acknowledgement. And then the court dismissed the plaintiff's compensation claims. The ruling held that individual reparation rights had been waived under the 1972 normalization agreement between Japan and China. The facts were real. The accountability was not. So an acknowledgement without consequence. The Japanese government never formally apologized specifically for Unit 731. Not in 1945, not in 1972, not in 2002. Not today. There have been general expressions of regret about wartime conduct, carefully worded statements that stop precisely short of naming what was done and who did it. Nothing specific, nothing that says Pingfang existed, we authorized it, we staffed it, we funded it, we're sorry. The statement's never been made. Now I want to return to where this story began, because there's a final irony to the American cover-up that I think deserves to be said plainly. The decision to bury Unit 731, to grant immunity, to classify the data, to publicly dismiss the Khabarovsky trial as propaganda was made, at least in part, to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining access to the research, to keep it out of enemy hands, to protect American strategic interests in the early Cold War. That was the logic. Here's what actually happened. Starting in the early 50s and continuing for more than 3 decades, the Soviet Union used the existence of the American cover-up as one of its most effective propaganda weapons against the United States. Soviet radio broadcasts accused the US of using biological weapons in Korea, in Vietnam, in Cuba. They named Unit 731 explicitly. They named the immunity deal and the data transfer. Some of what they said was distorted, and some of it was outright fabricated. But the core of it, the fact that the United States granted immunity to war criminals in exchange for biological warfare data, that was true. And the CIA knew it was true, because the CIA was monitoring those broadcasts and sitting on documents that confirmed the substance of what Moscow was saying. The cover-up that was designed to protect American interests handed the Soviets a weapon they used against America for 40 years. The secret that Americans paid so much to keep was the very secret that kept being used against them. I mentioned in 2018, Japan's National Archives released the names of 3,607 Unit 731 members. Researchers and journalists cross-referenced those names with public records. They found doctors, professors, hospital administrators, public health officials, men who built long, respectable, successful careers in post-war Japanese society. Men whose colleagues, in many cases, had known or suspected where they were during the war and said nothing. The list didn't produce prosecutions or apologies. It produced a list. This is the reckoning that wasn't. A court ruling that acknowledged the truth and denied the remedy, a government that released names but not accountability, an American cover-up that protected no one in the end, not the American interests, not Japanese careers, not even the secret itself. And the people at the center of it all, the people in the cells, the people staked to posts, the people on the operating tables at Pingfang, they got none of it. Shiro Ishii told his staff to take the secret to their graves. Some of them tried, some of them couldn't. Secrets like this one don't stay buried. They migrate. History has a way of finding the light. What I keep coming back to, what I think deserves to sit with you after everything you've heard today, is not the experiments themselves, as devastating as they are. It's the chain of decisions made by people who knew. At every step, someone knew. At every step, someone made a choice. The people in the cells at Pingfang didn't get to make the choices. They didn't get to decide whether their suffering was worth a military advantage that may or may not have existed. They were called logs. They were used. They were killed so that there'd be no witnesses. And then the people who used them made deals and built careers and published papers and ran pharmaceutical companies and then died in their beds. The victims of Pingfang have a museum now. It's at the site of the compound in what is today Harbin, China. The Chinese government established a memorial there in 1982. There aren't many names. Most of the people who died at Pingfang are unknown. They were unknown when they arrived. I'm John Genoa, and you've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.